For 8 years, Dean Martin was a ghost, walking among the living. His real death wasn't on Christmas, 1995. It was the day he stood at his son's graveside, and something inside him died. Forever. March 24, 1987. 3 days had passed since Captain Dean Paul Martin's F-4 Phantom jet had crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains. And now Dean Martin stood at the edge of a grave that would hold more than just his son's body. As the military honor guard folded the American flag that had draped Dean Paul's casket, something fundamental broke inside Dean Martin that would never heal. The funeral had been everything. Dean Paul deserved full military honors, a 21-gun salute, and hundreds of mourners, including Hollywood's biggest names. Frank Sinatra had flown in from New York. The entire Rat Pack was there. Dean's ex-wives, his other children, industry executives, and military officials all gathered to pay their respects to the 35-year-old pilot who had been following in his father's footsteps in both entertainment and service. But as Dean watched the honor guard present him with that perfectly folded flag, those present noticed something chilling. Dean Martin didn't cry. He didn't speak. He barely seemed to breathe. He stood there like a man who had already left his own body. It was the strangest thing. Jerry Lewis would later recall. Dean was there, physically, but when I looked in his eyes, there was nothing. It was like looking at an empty house. The graveside service was brief and dignified. Dean Paul's fellow pilots spoke about his dedication, his skill, and his pride in carrying on the Martin family name. Dean's daughter Deanna read a poem about fathers and sons. Frank Sinatra, fighting back tears, spoke about watching Dean Paul grow up and how proud Dean had always been of his boy. Through it all, Dean Martin stood motionless beside the grave. He held the folded flag in his hands, but he never looked at it. His eyes were fixed on the casket as it was lowered into the ground, and witnesses said his expression never changed. When the ceremony ended and people began to offer their condolences, something became clear to everyone present. Dean Martin was no longer responding to anything or anyone around him. People would approach him, take his hand, speak words of comfort, and Dean would nod mechanically, but there was no recognition in his eyes. "Dad," Deanna whispered, touching his arm. "Dad, it's time to go." Dean turned his head toward her voice, but for a terrifying moment, Deanna thought he didn't recognize her. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "He's really gone," Dean said. Not a question, not a cry of anguish, just a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that made everyone around him shiver. Frank Sinatra tried to put his arm around his old friend. "Dino, come on, let me take you home." But Dean pulled away from Frank's embrace, something he had never done in 40 years of friendship. "I want to stay here for a while." "Dean, you can come back tomorrow. You need to be with your family now." Dean shook his head slowly. "This is where I belong now with Dean Paul." It took 4 people to convince Dean to leave the cemetery that day. Even then, he kept looking back at the grave as if he was abandoning his son all over again. What happened over the next 8 years was unlike any grief process anyone had ever witnessed. Dean Martin didn't gradually heal or slowly rebuild his life. Instead, he simply stopped living. He continued to exist, to go through the motions of daily life, but everyone who knew him understood that the real Dean Martin had been buried with Dean Paul on March 24, 1987. The changes were immediate and huge. Dean, who had been known for his warmth and humor, became cold and distant. He stopped telling jokes. He stopped that casual, effortless charm that had been his trademark for decades. Most heartbreakingly, he stopped singing. He would sit in his house for hours just staring at photographs of Dean Paul. His housekeeper, Anna Martinez, remembered. Years later, he wouldn't eat unless someone put food in front of him. He wouldn't change clothes unless someone laid them out. It was like he had forgotten how to take care of himself. Dean's surviving children watched in horror as their father became a stranger. He would look at them as if he couldn't quite remember who they were or why they were there. When they tried to engage him in conversation about family matters, career decisions, or even simple things like what he wanted for dinner, Dean would stare at them blankly. Before saying, "Ask Dean Paul. He'll know what to do." The entertainment industry tried to coax Dean back to work, thinking that performing might help him heal. But when promoters and managers came to discuss potential shows, Dean would listen politely and then ask, "Will Dean Paul be there?" When they gently reminded him that Dean Paul was gone, Dean would nod and say, "Then I'm not interested." Frank Sinatra made dozens of attempts to reach his old friend. He would call, visit, even show up unannounced at Dean's Beverly Hills home, but every conversation was the same. "How are you doing, Dino?" "I'm waiting." Waiting for what? For Dean Paul to come home. Frank would try to engage Dean in memories of their good times together, their performances, their friendship, but Dean seemed unable to access any memories that didn't include Dean Paul. It was as if his entire past had been erased except for the parts that involved his son, Jerry Lewis. Despite their complicated history, also tried to help. During one visit, Jerry found Dean sitting in Dean Paul's old bedroom, which had been preserved exactly as it was when Dean Paul was a teenager. "Dean, this isn't healthy. You can't live in the past." Dean looked at Jerry with confusion. "What past? This is now. Dean Paul will be home from school soon." Jerry realized with horror that Dean wasn't being metaphorical. He genuinely seemed to believe that Dean Paul was still alive, that the funeral had been some kind of mistake or bad dream. Dr. Patricia Nolan, a psychiatrist who was quietly consulted by the family, explained that Dean was experiencing a form of dissociative disorder brought on by traumatic grief. He's created a psychological wall between himself and the reality of his son's death. Dr. Nolan told Dean's daughter Claudia. In his mind, accepting Dean Paul's death would mean accepting his own death. So, his psyche has simply rejected the entire reality. The most disturbing aspect of Dean's condition was how he began to fade physically. He stopped caring about his appearance, lost significant weight, and seemed to be aging at an accelerated rate. People who saw him during this period described him as looking see-through, as if he was slowly disappearing. "It was like watching someone die in slow motion," said Charlie Hadge, Dean's longtime friend and employee. Every month there was less of him there. Not just physically, but spiritually. Dean Martin was evaporating. Dean's business affairs fell into chaos. He stopped signing contracts, paying bills, or making any decisions about his career or finances. His management team had to take over completely, but they faced an impossible situation. How do you manage the career of someone who no longer acknowledges that they have a career? The few times Dean ventured out in public during those 8 years, witnesses described encounters that were both heartbreaking and disturbing. He would sometimes approach strangers who reminded him of Dean Paul, young men in their 30s, with dark hair, and begin conversations as if they were his son. "Dean Paul, there you are," he would say. "Your mother has been looking for you." When gently corrected by family members or friends, Dean would become confused and withdrawn, as if he couldn't understand why everyone was pretending not to see. Dean Paul. During the last few years of this period, Dean began spending most of his time at the cemetery. He would drive there in the morning and sit by Dean Paul's grave for hours, having full conversations with the headstone. Cemetery groundskeepers reported that Dean would bring 2 cups of coffee and would set one on Dean Paul's grave while drinking the other. He would update his son on family news, discuss business decisions, and ask for advice about everything from what to have for dinner to whether he should return Frank's phone calls. Mr. Martin treated that grave like it was his son's office, said groundskeeper Miguel Santos. He would sit there and talk just like they were having a business meeting. Sometimes he would laugh like Dean Paul had told him a joke. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. On December 25, 1995, Dean Martin's body finally caught up with his spirit. He was found in his bedroom, having died peacefully in his sleep on Christmas morning. But those closest to him understood that this was just the physical conclusion of a death that had occurred 8 years earlier. At Dean Martin's funeral, Frank Sinatra delivered a eulogy that shocked everyone present. "We're not here to mourn Dean Martin's death," Frank said, his voice breaking. "We're here to acknowledge what we've all known for 8 years. Dean died on March 24, 1987, the day we buried Dean Paul. Today we're finally laying the rest of him to rest." Jerry Lewis, speaking at the service, was even more direct. Dean Martin was the walking dead for 8 years. He was a ghost who couldn't find his way to the light because he didn't want to go anywhere his son couldn't follow. The most telling detail of Dean Martin's final years was found after his death. In his bedroom, investigators discovered a calendar where Dean had marked every single day since March 24, 1987 with a simple notation, day number without Dean Paul. December 25, 1995 was marked as day 3027 without Dean Paul. But perhaps even more revealing was what they found on his nightstand. A letter addressed to Dean Paul dated the night before Dean died. "Dear son, I've been waiting for you to come get me for 8 years now. I know you're busy up there, but I'm ready whenever you are. I've kept your room exactly like you left it, and I've been taking care of your mother and sisters like you asked me to. But I'm tired now. Dean Paul, I'm so very tired. If it's okay with you, I think I'll come home now. Love, Dad." Dean Martin's official death certificate lists his cause of death as acute respiratory failure. But his family knew better. Dean Martin died of a broken heart on March 24, 1987. It just took his body 8 years to get the message. The tragedy of Dean Martin's final years wasn't just that he lost his son. It was that he lost himself so completely that he couldn't find a way to continue living. He became a cautionary tale about grief so profound that it doesn't heal. It just hollows you out until there's nothing left. Frank Sinatra, in his final interview before his own death, was asked about losing Dean Martin twice, once to grief and once to death. The Dean Martin everyone loved, the guy who made everything look easy and cool. He died the day Dean Paul did. Frank said what walked around for 8 years after that was just Dean's body trying to figure out how to stop breathing. When it finally happened on Christmas Day, it wasn't sad. It was a mercy. But perhaps the most profound observation about Dean Martin's living death came from his daughter Deanna, who spent those 8 years watching her father fade away. "People think grief is about missing someone who's gone," she said, But what happened? To my father was different. He didn't miss Dean Paul. He joined him. Dad spent 8 years living in whatever place Dean Paul had gone to, and his body just hadn't figured out how to follow yet. When he finally died, it wasn't death. It was a reunion. The story of Dean Martin's 8-year death is a reminder that sometimes love is so powerful that it cannot survive the loss of its object. Dean Martin loved Dean Paul so completely that he literally could not exist in a world without him. On Dean Martin's gravestone next to the dates that mark his physical life and death, his family added a smaller inscription that tells the real story. Reunited with Dean Paul, March 24, 1987, because that's when Dean Martin really died. December 25, 1995 was just when everyone else finally found out. If this story of love so powerful it conquers life itself moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who understands that some bonds between people are stronger than death itself. Have you ever loved someone so much that losing them felt like losing yourself? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to check out our other videos about the unbreakable connections that define us.